You're at a dinner party with your closest friends. The wine is flowing, laughter fills the air, and someone suggests something that would change your lives forever. What if you could swap spouses for a night? What could possibly go wrong? For Thomas and Catherine Wright, and their best friends Robert and Rebecca Martinez, this wasn't just a wild conversation over dinner. It became their reality. A thrilling secret that added spark to their marriages and brought them closer together as friends. But what started as consensual fun between four adults would spiral into the darkest corners of human obsession. Because when Thomas looked at his friend's wife Rebecca, he didn't just see an exciting arrangement anymore. He saw his future. He saw love. He saw possession. And when Rebecca tried to end their little game, Thomas saw red. Tonight, we're diving into a case that proves your neighbors might not be who you think they are. Where suburban perfection hides deadly secrets, and where a wife swap fantasy becomes a husband's murderous obsession. This is the story of how four friends became two killers, one victim, and one shattered survivor. You're about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous person in your life is the one you trust the most. And sometimes, saying no can cost you everything. Welcome to True Crime Family Corner, where we dive deep into the most shocking cases that reveal the dark secrets hiding behind closed doors. I'm your host, and tonight's story will leave you questioning how well you really know your neighbors. Make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell because you won't want to miss a single detail of this twisted tale. Stay with us until the end as we reveal how justice finally caught up with the killers. In the peaceful town of Cedar Hills, a brutal murder sent shockwaves through what appeared to be a perfect suburban community. The victim was Rebecca Martinez, a vibrant woman whose life was cut short by someone she trusted. What seemed like a close-knit neighborhood was actually hiding dark secrets about the unconventional relationships between two couples whose lives had become dangerously intertwined. Thomas and Catherine Wright were the picture of suburban success. Thomas, a respected architect, was known throughout the community for his charming personality and innovative building designs. His wife, Catherine, taught third grade at the local elementary school, where children adored her gentle nature and parents respected her dedication. They had been married for 10 years and lived in a beautiful house on Oak Street, complete with Catherine's prized garden that was the envy of every neighbor. 5 years earlier, Robert and Rebecca Martinez had moved to Cedar Hills and quickly became the Wrights' closest friends. Robert worked as a financial advisor and had a magnetic personality that made him the life of every party. Rebecca possessed striking beauty and a warm, engaging personality that drew people to her like a magnet. The Martinez family brought fresh energy to the neighborhood, and their friendship with the Wrights blossomed over shared interests and genuine mutual respect. The idea that would ultimately lead to tragedy first came up during a dinner party at the Wright home. Fueled by wine and a spirit of adventure, the conversation naturally turned to the topic of open relationships and alternative lifestyles. To everyone's surprise, instead of shock or judgment, the concept was met with curiosity and genuine interest from all four participants. Over the following weeks, the idea was discussed more seriously and thoroughly. All parties agreed to establish clear boundaries and specific rules to ensure that their primary marriages remained strong and intact. The first encounter was undoubtedly awkward but also exciting for everyone involved. Thomas and Rebecca, along with Robert and Catherine, exchanged partners for the night. It was a thrilling yet nerve-wracking experience that left them all eager to explore this new dynamic further. Before we continue with this shocking story, make sure you're subscribed to True Crime Family Corner. We bring you the most gripping cases every week, and trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next in this twisted tale of obsession and murder. What initially started as an occasional experiment soon evolved into a regular part of their lives, adding what seemed like a healthy spark to both marriages. At first, the arrangement appeared to work perfectly well for everyone involved. Both couples seemed happier and more connected than ever before. They maintained their active social lives, frequently hosting joint parties and taking exciting vacations together as a group. Their intimate secret was carefully guarded and protected, discussed only within the privacy of their homes or during their private gatherings away from prying eyes. The novelty of the arrangement brought a sense of exhilaration and adventure to their lives, and for several months, it seemed like they had discovered the perfect balance between marriage and exploration. However, as time passed, subtle but concerning changes began to surface, particularly in Thomas's behavior and demeanor. He started showing an unusual and increasingly intense amount of interest in Rebecca, often finding creative reasons to spend time alone with her outside of their agreed arrangements. Catherine noticed her husband's growing preoccupation with Rebecca, but initially chose to ignore the warning signs, hoping desperately that it was just a temporary phase that would pass naturally. Robert also seemed completely oblivious to the growing tension and undercurrents of obsession that were developing right under his nose. What none of them realized was that Thomas's fascination with Rebecca was slowly transforming into something far deeper and more troubling than anyone could have imagined. He found himself thinking about her constantly throughout the day, replaying their intimate encounters over and over in his mind, and craving increasingly more time and attention from her. What had started as a harmless adventure between consenting adults was slowly morphing into a dangerous obsession that would have absolutely devastating consequences for everyone involved in this tragic story. Thomas's fascination with Rebecca was no longer just a harmless thrill or exciting diversion from routine married life. It had evolved into a completely all-consuming obsession that dominated his every waking moment. He thought about her incessantly during work meetings, family dinners, and even while lying in bed next to his wife. His architectural projects, which had once been his greatest passion and source of pride, now seemed completely secondary to his overwhelming desire for Rebecca's attention and affection. He began finding increasingly creative ways to be near her, volunteering to help with tasks that Robert usually handled, or inviting the Martinez family over more frequently than their arrangement called for. His behavior became more calculated and deliberate as his obsession deepened with each passing day. Catherine began to notice the dramatic change in her husband's behavior and attitude. At first, she attributed his distraction and mood changes to the excitement of their new lifestyle experiment. However, it soon became painfully clear that Thomas's interest in Rebecca went far beyond their agreed-upon arrangement and boundaries. He became irritable and noticeably distant whenever they weren't spending time with the Martinez family, and his conversations began to revolve almost exclusively around Rebecca's preferences, likes and dislikes, her quirks, and her daily habits. Don't forget to subscribe and share this video with your true crime family. The story is about to take a dark and deadly turn that will shock you. One evening, while Catherine was cleaning up after hosting another dinner party, she finally confronted Thomas directly about his obvious obsession. His reaction was immediately defensive and hostile, dismissing her legitimate concerns as nothing more than petty jealousy. Catherine, not wanting to disrupt the delicate balance they had all worked to establish, reluctantly let the matter go, but began keeping a much closer and more watchful eye on her husband's behavior. Her suspicions continued to grow stronger when she caught him staring intensely at Rebecca during their social gatherings, his gaze lingering far longer than was appropriate or comfortable. The intensity in his eyes was unmistakable and deeply unsettling to witness. Rebecca also began to sense Thomas's growing obsession and unhealthy fixation on her. Initially, she had been flattered by his extra attention and compliments, but she soon found his behavior increasingly uncomfortable and inappropriate. His touches became more possessive and lingering, his words more intimate and personal than what their arrangement called for. She discussed her growing discomfort with Robert, who unfortunately brushed off her concerns, believing that Thomas was simply more expressive and emotional in showing his affections than most men. Robert's dismissive attitude and unwillingness to take her concerns seriously left Rebecca feeling completely isolated and alone in dealing with this increasingly problematic situation. The turning point in this tragic story came during what was supposed to be a relaxing weekend trip to a beautiful lakeside cabin. The couples had planned this getaway to reconnect with each other and enjoy some peaceful time away from their daily routine and responsibilities. However, the trip only served to highlight and amplify Thomas's dangerous fixation on Rebecca in the most disturbing way possible. Thomas monopolized Rebecca's time throughout the entire weekend, insisting on taking her out on the lake alone in a small boat, while leaving Robert and Catherine behind at the cabin. The tension in the air was thick and palpable, and Rebecca's attempts to distance herself from Thomas were consistently met with subtle but firm resistance and manipulation. One night, while the group sat around a crackling fire under the stars, Thomas made a comment that crossed every line imaginable. He spoke openly about leaving everything behind and starting a completely fresh life, just the two of them together. Rebecca was shocked and deeply unsettled by his words. She quickly excused herself and went to bed early, her mind racing with fear and concern about Thomas's deteriorating mental state. Catherine, who had overheard the entire disturbing conversation, confronted Thomas once again about his inappropriate behavior. This time, he was slightly less dismissive of her concerns, but still stubbornly refused to acknowledge the true depth and dangerous nature of his obsessive feelings for Rebecca. If you're enjoying this deep dive into true crime, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We're just getting to the most shocking part of this story. Catherine's frustration and concern grew exponentially as she began to fully realize the extent of Thomas's unhealthy obsession. She genuinely loved her husband and wanted to save their marriage, but she was becoming increasingly aware that his dangerous infatuation with Rebecca had the potential to destroy not only their marriage, but also their long-standing friendship with the Martinez family. Despite Catherine's desperate efforts to intervene and bring Thomas back to reality, his behavior only became more erratic and unpredictable with each passing day. He started following Rebecca outside of their agreed-upon meetings and arrangements, showing up uninvited at her yoga classes, and even appearing at her workplace under the transparent guise of casual, friendly visits. Rebecca's initial unease quickly transformed into genuine fear for her safety and well-being. She confided her concerns to a close friend, who strongly advised her to distance herself from Thomas as much as possible and consider involving the authorities if his stalking behavior continued or escalated further. Determined to take control of the increasingly dangerous situation, Rebecca made the difficult decision to end their arrangement altogether and permanently. She hoped that by taking this decisive action, Thomas would finally come to his senses and return to normal behavior, allowing all of them to move on from this disturbing chapter without causing any further harm to their relationships or families. One evening, while Robert was away on an important business trip, Thomas showed up at the Martinez house completely unannounced and uninvited. Rebecca was taken aback by his unexpected appearance, but reluctantly let him inside, hoping to avoid creating a public scene that might alert the neighbors to their private troubles. Rebecca told Thomas firmly and clearly that their arrangement was completely over and that he needed to respect her boundaries and her marriage to Robert. She made it crystal clear that his behavior had become unacceptable and frightening, and that any further contact outside of normal neighborly interactions was unwelcome. Thomas, visibly shaken by her definitive rejection, desperately tried to persuade her to reconsider her decision. He pleaded with her, made promises to change his behavior, and even threatened to reveal their secret arrangement to the entire neighborhood if she didn't agree to continue their relationship. However, Rebecca stood her ground with remarkable courage and determination, refusing to be manipulated or intimidated by his threats. Over the next few days, Rebecca did everything possible to avoid Thomas, hoping desperately that he would finally accept reality and come to his senses about the situation. She confided in Catherine, who listened with a heavy heart full of conflicting emotions. Catherine knew that her husband's obsession had spiraled completely out of control, and while she wanted to support Rebecca and do the right thing, she also felt a twisted sense of loyalty to Thomas and their marriage. Catherine promised Rebecca that she would have a serious conversation with Thomas and convince him to let go of his obsession and move on with his life. However, deep down, she feared that her husband was already too far gone to be reasoned with or brought back to reality. Thomas, completely unable to accept Rebecca's firm rejection, grew increasingly desperate and dangerous. His mental state deteriorated rapidly as he accused Rebecca of deliberately leading him on and playing cruel games with his emotions. Rebecca, maintaining her composure despite her growing fear, insisted that they must part ways permanently and return to focusing on their respective marriages and families. Unknown to both Thomas and Rebecca, Catherine had secretly followed her husband to a local park where he had arranged to meet Rebecca for what she hoped would be their final conversation. Catherine watched from a hidden distance, her heart pounding with anxiety and dread as she witnessed the confrontation unfolding between her husband and the woman who had unknowingly become the object of his deadly obsession. She could clearly see the anguish and rage building on Thomas's face, contrasted sharply with the determination and resolve visible in Rebecca's posture and demeanor. Catherine knew instinctively that the situation was about to spiral completely out of control, and she made the split-second decision to step out of her hiding place and approach the two people who had become central to her life's greatest crisis. Her voice was shaking with emotion and fear as she called out to Thomas, hoping to defuse the tension before it exploded into violence. The sight of his wife seemed to momentarily snap Thomas out of his rage-filled trance, and he turned to Catherine with an expression that mixed confusion, relief, and desperate hope for understanding. Rebecca, recognizing this as her opportunity to escape the increasingly volatile situation, quickly walked away with determination, putting as much distance as possible between herself and Thomas. She was resolved to never again put herself in a position where she would be alone with this clearly unstable and dangerous man. Catherine, now alone with her deeply troubled husband, tried desperately to calm him down and bring him back to reality. She reassured him that together they would find a way to move past this crisis and rebuild their marriage. But inside her heart, she knew that their relationship had been fundamentally damaged, possibly beyond repair. The rejection and public humiliation had shaken Thomas to his very core, leaving him feeling exposed and vulnerable in ways he had never experienced before. He returned home that night with his mind spinning in a chaotic whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and complete despair. Catherine, sensing the dangerous storm brewing within her husband's troubled psyche, tried desperately to soothe his tormented thoughts and bring him some measure of peace. But Thomas remained completely inconsolable and unreachable. Make sure you're still subscribed because this story is about to take its most shocking turn yet. The obsession is about to turn deadly. Over the next several days, Thomas's behavior became increasingly erratic and unpredictable, swinging wildly between intense bouts of explosive anger and periods of deep, overwhelming despondency. He stopped going to work entirely, instead spending his days obsessing over Rebecca's rejection and the perceived injustices that he believed he had suffered at her hands. Catherine, feeling completely unable to reach her husband or help him through this crisis, feared for both his mental health and the safety of everyone around him. She made the difficult decision to contact Rebecca and arrange a meeting to discuss Thomas's increasingly unstable and dangerous behavior. Thomas continued to appear at Rebecca's house uninvited, despite her clear requests for him to stay away. The harassment and stalking behavior escalated to the point where Rebecca felt unsafe in her own home and neighborhood. One evening, as she returned home from work, she found Thomas waiting for her outside her house once again. Her heart sank at the sight of him, and she steeled herself for yet another confrontation that she desperately wanted to avoid. She approached him cautiously, keeping her distance while maintaining a steady, firm voice as she once again told him to leave her property immediately. Thomas, his eyes wild with desperation and barely contained rage, begged her for just one last chance to explain himself and make her understand his feelings. Rebecca, recognizing the complete futility of any further conversation with this clearly unstable man, attempted to walk past him and enter her home safely. However, Thomas grabbed her arm with a grip that was both painful and threatening, his desperation overriding any remaining sense of boundaries or appropriate behavior. Rebecca, now genuinely terrified for her physical safety, managed to break free from his grasp and quickly made her way inside her house, immediately locking the door behind her and considering whether she should call the police. The next day, Catherine reached out to Rebecca and requested an urgent meeting to discuss how they might handle Thomas's increasingly dangerous and unstable behavior before someone got seriously hurt. Rebecca, exhausted and stressed from constantly looking over her shoulder, agreed to meet with Catherine, hoping that together they might find a solution to this nightmare situation. They met at a quiet local cafe, where Rebecca, looking visibly exhausted and tense, explained her most recent frightening encounter with Thomas and her growing, legitimate fear for her personal safety. Catherine listened intently, her mind racing as she tried to formulate some kind of plan that would protect everyone involved while getting her husband the help he desperately needed. Catherine promised Rebecca that she would have another serious conversation with Thomas and make him understand once and for all that their relationship was completely over and that his behavior had become completely unacceptable. After their meeting, Catherine returned home with a heavy heart, only to find that Thomas had reached a terrifying conclusion about how to solve what he saw as his problem. In his twisted and deteriorating mental state, Thomas had decided that the only way to resolve the situation and end his suffering was to eliminate the source of his pain entirely. His obsession had transformed into something far more sinister and deadly. He had convinced himself that if he couldn't have Rebecca for himself, then absolutely no one else should be allowed to have her either. On a cold, clear night that would forever change multiple lives, Thomas made his way to the Martinez house with deadly intent. He knew that Robert was out of town on business, leaving Rebecca alone and vulnerable in the house they had shared as a happy couple. Using his knowledge of the house's layout from their previous social visits, he broke in through a side window that he knew was often left unlocked. Thomas made his way through the dark house to the bedroom where Rebecca lay sleeping peacefully, completely unaware of the danger that had entered her home. The sight of her lying there, innocent and defenseless, should have brought him to his senses, but instead it only fueled his rage and desperate obsession with possessing her completely. He grabbed a sharp kitchen knife from their knife block and approached her bed, his mind filled with a chaotic and dangerous mix of love, hate, obsession, and murderous intent. In a moment of explosive violence, Thomas ended Rebecca's life, forever silencing the woman who had become the center of his deadly obsession. When Thomas returned home covered in blood and completely incoherent, Catherine immediately realized what her husband had done. In a moment that would define the rest of her life, she made the shocking decision to help him cover up his terrible crime. The life they had carefully built together, filled with secrets they had kept, was now at stake, and Catherine knew that if they were going to survive the consequences of Thomas's actions, they needed to act quickly and decisively. Don't forget to subscribe to True Crime Family Corner for more shocking stories like this one. We're approaching the dramatic conclusion of this twisted tale. Catherine, driven by a complicated mix of twisted loyalty to her husband and desperate self-preservation, quickly took complete control of the horrifying situation they now faced together. She led the blood-covered and traumatized Thomas to their bathroom, firmly instructing him to remove all of his clothes and wash off every trace of Rebecca's blood from his body and hands. Catherine's mind was racing at lightning speed as she tried to think of every possible detail that could link them to the brutal crime. Thomas, still in a state of shock and completely unable to think clearly or provide a coherent account of what he had done, relied entirely on his wife to guide him through the cover-up process. Catherine quickly devised what she believed was a foolproof plan to protect them both from the consequences of Thomas's actions. They desperately needed to create a solid alibi that would place them far away from the crime scene, and they had to dispose of any physical evidence that could possibly link them to Rebecca's murder. Catherine called a trusted friend, claiming that Thomas had been with her at home all evening, carefully ensuring that their alibi would be backed up by a reliable witness if the police came asking questions. Then, in the early hours of the morning, she drove to a secluded area far outside of town, where she built a fire and burned Thomas's blood-stained clothes along with the murder weapon, praying desperately that the flames would completely consume any remaining physical evidence that could connect them to the crime. The police quickly launched a thorough investigation into Rebecca's brutal murder, but the Garners had managed to cover their tracks well enough to avoid immediate suspicion. However, living with their terrible secret began taking a devastating toll on both of them in different ways. Thomas, overwhelmed by crushing guilt and the magnitude of what he had done, withdrew completely from his friends and colleagues, isolating himself in a suffocating web of fear, regret, and paranoid anxiety. Catherine, while maintaining an outwardly composed facade for the benefit of those around them, felt the enormous strain of their shared secret pressing down on her consciousness every single day. She became hypervigilant and paranoid, carefully scrutinizing every interaction and conversation for any signs of suspicion from neighbors, friends, or investigators who might be getting too close to the truth. The weeks immediately following Rebecca's shocking murder were filled with tension and elaborate deception for the Wright family. Catherine took on the exhausting role of being the stabilizer in their relationship, constantly managing Thomas's increasing paranoia and anxiety while ensuring that their public facade as the grieving friends remained completely convincing to everyone around them. Thomas played his part as the devastated friend with what seemed like genuine emotion and sincerity. He spoke of Rebecca with a carefully calculated mix of fondness and sorrow, his eyes often welling up with what appeared to be tears of grief rather than guilt. Robert, who was completely devastated by the loss of his beloved wife and desperate for any answers about who could have committed such a terrible crime, seemed to genuinely appreciate Thomas's apparent empathy and support during his darkest hours. Robert never suspected for even a moment that his closest friend had been directly responsible for his wife's brutal death. However, Thomas's mental state continued to deteriorate rapidly under the enormous pressure of his guilt and the constant fear of being discovered. His overwhelming guilt manifested itself in terrifying nightmares and disturbing hallucinations that left him unable to sleep or function normally. He started drinking heavily and continuously, desperately seeking some temporary solace and escape in alcohol, but finding only brief and inadequate relief from his tormented conscience. Catherine, growing increasingly fearful that Thomas might confess their terrible secret during one of his frequent drunken episodes, made the decision to take him away from their home and the scene of their crime. They traveled to a remote cabin in the mountains, far from the ongoing police investigation and the prying eyes of their neighbors and friends. The isolation of the mountain retreat provided them with temporary respite from the constant pressure and allowed them to plan their next moves without the investigation looming over their daily lives. During their time at the secluded cabin, Catherine reinforced the critical importance of maintaining their secrecy at all costs. She coached Thomas extensively on how to handle any future police questioning and public interactions, drilling him repeatedly until he could respond to difficult questions without hesitation or suspicious behavior. Catherine's fierce determination to protect their lifestyle and avoid spending the rest of their lives in prison fueled her relentless drive to keep their story consistent and believable, no matter what the cost to their consciences or their relationship. However, despite their careful planning and preparation, rumors began to circulate throughout their community about Thomas's strange behavior and the unusual amount of time he had been spending with Rebecca before her murder. Catherine, ever vigilant about protecting their secret, worked tirelessly to quash these dangerous rumors and redirect suspicion away from them, but she knew deep in her heart that their time was running out. Subscribe now if you haven't already. We're about to reveal how justice finally caught up with these killers. As the thorough police investigation continued to make progress, new and damning evidence came to light that pointed directly towards significant inconsistencies in Thomas's carefully constructed alibi. The Wright family's meticulously crafted world was teetering on the brink of complete collapse, and the truth about Rebecca's murder was much closer to being revealed than either of them had realized. Detective Maria Rodriguez, the lead investigator on the case, was a seasoned professional who had built her reputation on her ability to see through lies and uncover the truth in even the most complex cases. She decided to interview the Wrights separately, carefully noting any discrepancies or inconsistencies in their individual stories about the night of the murder. Catherine's carefully crafted alibi initially held up well under Detective Rodriguez's skilled scrutiny, as she had rehearsed every detail countless times. However, Thomas, who was struggling desperately to maintain his composure under the intense pressure of the interrogation, stuck to the story that Catherine had coached him on, but his obvious nervousness, evasive answers, and suspicious body language only served to heighten Detective Rodriguez's growing suspicions about their involvement. The turning point in the entire investigation came when a neighbor finally came forward with crucial information that would break the case wide open. This witness had seen Thomas's distinctive car parked suspiciously near the Martinez house on the night of Rebecca's murder and clearly remembered the strange, agitated behavior that Thomas had exhibited when they had encountered him leaving the area. This eyewitness testimony, when combined with the mounting forensic evidence and Thomas's increasingly erratic behavior during questioning, provided Detective Rodriguez with enough evidence to move forward with arrests in the case. As the walls closed in around them and their carefully constructed lies began to unravel completely, Catherine and Thomas faced the harsh and unavoidable reality of their situation. The elaborate web of lies and deception that had once protected them from justice was now threatening to collapse entirely, and the truth about their terrible crime was about to be revealed in a way that neither of them could have anticipated or prepared for. As the overwhelming evidence against Thomas continued to mount, and become undeniable, Detective Rodriguez prepared to make her decisive move in bringing the killers to justice. She brought Thomas in for another round of intensive questioning, this time armed with all of the evidence that had been gathered during the thorough investigation. Faced with the undeniable physical evidence and eyewitness testimony, Thomas finally broke down completely under the enormous pressure and confessed to the brutal murder of Rebecca Martinez. Through his tears and overwhelming guilt, he described in detail how his obsession with Rebecca had driven him to break into her home and take her life in a moment of explosive rage and desperation. However, in his emotional confession, Thomas also implicated Catherine by revealing her crucial role in covering up the crime and helping him avoid detection. He described in detail how she had helped him clean up the physical evidence, dispose of his blood-stained clothing and the murder weapon, and create the elaborate alibi that had initially protected them from suspicion. Detective Rodriguez, recognizing an opportunity to get the complete story and ensure that justice was served for all parties involved in this terrible crime, immediately had Catherine brought in for her own round of intensive questioning. When confronted with Thomas's detailed confession and the evidence of her participation in the cover-up, Catherine initially denied any involvement in the crime or its aftermath. However, as Detective Rodriguez methodically detailed all of the evidence and Thomas's specific account of her actions, Catherine finally realized that there was no point in continuing to lie and deny her role in helping her husband escape justice. Catherine and Thomas were both formally charged with their respective crimes. Thomas faced charges of first-degree murder for the brutal killing of Rebecca Martinez, while Catherine was charged with accessory after the fact and obstruction of justice for her role in covering up the crime and helping Thomas avoid arrest. Both defendants ultimately decided to plead guilty to their respective charges rather than face the uncertainty and potential additional penalties of a lengthy trial. Thomas was sentenced to life in prison without any possibility of parole, ensuring that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars paying for his terrible crime. Catherine, despite her significant role in the cover-up and obstruction of the investigation, received a considerably lighter sentence due to her eventual cooperation with the investigation and her previously clean criminal record. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison with the possibility of parole after serving 10 years of her sentence. Robert Martinez, who was left to somehow pick up the pieces of his completely shattered life after losing his beloved wife in such a brutal and senseless way, found some measure of solace in knowing that justice had finally been served and that those responsible for Rebecca's death would pay the appropriate price for their terrible actions. This tragic case serves as a stark reminder of how consensual arrangements between adults can spiral completely out of control when boundaries are crossed and obsession takes hold. What began as an adventurous lifestyle choice between two couples ended in murder, betrayal, and the complete destruction of multiple lives and families. Thank you for joining us for another episode of True Crime Family Corner. If this case shocked you as much as it shocked us, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest true crime investigations. Share this video with your true crime family and let us know in the comments what you think about this twisted case of obsession turned deadly. Until next time, stay safe out there.